Yes, I'm David. I'm the Director of Strategy and Programmes at Cause 4. Cause 4 are a fundraising agency, although we tend not to say the word agency because we sort of do lots of other things as well. We do fundraising, of course. We do a lot of coaching, training, mentoring, and we also run a number of large-scale programmes, which is the bulk of my job. We're an Arts Council England funded sector support organisation. The programme's called Arts Fundraising and Philanthropy. And we lead that partnership with the University of Leeds and the Arts Marketing Association. And we have just launched, in a shameless plug, a programme called Heritage Compass, which is funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. And again, sees us leading a programme of support for small to medium-sized heritage organisations, 150 across the country, again with the Arts Marketing Association and also Creative United. So do look out for us blasting it out on social media and see if that's something that you might be interested in getting involved in. I've been in this role about 2.5 years, which over that time has been actually a lot of work with museums and the heritage sector, a lot more than I'd anticipated when I started the role. But prior to that, I was working in performing arts, mainly in art centres. I was at the Albany in Deptford in South East London for about 8 years as their head of development, so looking after commercial income and fundraising income as well. So hopefully I can share with you some thoughts and some thinking. And as Elizabeth said, it's a sort of strange time, isn't it? And a lot of us are finding ourselves in doing things that we didn't initially sign up to, whether that's going, oh my goodness, we've got to find some funds really quickly. My goodness, the fundraising person's only in a day a week now. We don't have a fundraising person, we never have, but suddenly income has sort of become crystal clear and a need for everybody. So this is a sort of very much an overview and introduction to what fundraising is all about, and as a starting point. And there are lots and lots of resources, both with London Museum Development, Arts Council England and ourselves, for further reading, further thinking, further discussion. So I'll signpost to all of those in the chat later on. And it's brilliant that we're joined by Arts Council England today as well. So live from the funder, so pressure's on Mirka there. 15 or so minutes of talking through the National Lottery Project grants later on. Right, let us get going. So we're going to cover a range of different conversations today. So we've got sort of what fundraising is actually, and the main types of fundraising that UK organisations, or specifically English and Welsh organisations, carry out at the moment. I want to talk a little bit about the context for your museums right now within COVID. We'll talk about building a strong case for support, or the rationale for why somebody would support you, which is sort of the pivotal fundraising document, if you like. I would suggest, if you have not fundraised before, asking your organisations if they've got a case for support and if they can talk about that a little bit more. Alice, yes, will share slides afterwards. I should have said that, apologies. Some top tips from me, and hopefully some discussion from you all about what you think will work, what you think won't work for your organisations. Then as we build, Mirka will be sharing a little bit about one of the Arts Council England funds with us. And finally, quite an open conversation, Q&A for either of us about any thoughts and further thinking you might have. So I'm going to talk you through sort of a classic model of what income looks like in organisations, just so we're all in the same frame of mind to start with, on the same page with regards to how organisations earn their money. And not all organisations will earn money from every way in this, but this is the kind of standard setup. So you have two main types of income: statutory income, which has been something that we've all really heavily focused on, I think, in the last 6 months, whether that's from your local authority, whether it's from Arts Council England, and we'll talk through what some of these are later. But that's sort of a grant that perhaps is paid over a number of years from a statutory provider. And everything else we talk about as being resilience income, or income that you're generating yourself in order to keep going. And the word resilience has been used so much in the last 6 months, but I think it's really starting to frame up what does resilience mean for your organisation? What is survival and thriving and continuing to earn an income so that you can generate your activity and run your museums and create the work that you do? We tend to split up the resilience income into two areas. So you have your earned income, which might be, and this diagram calls it artistic core, but in fact, if you think of it as sort of the core of what you do and who you are. So it might be ticketing, it might be paid for events within your museums. It might be your education work if there's sort of charges for that. And then the non-core bit, so the things that you do, sometimes it's called ancillary spend, where people can spend money with you, but it's not directly related to the museum and your core mission or vision. So that might be in bars or cafes, it might be in retail. Everything else we call contributed income, and this is a term that Arts Council England use often when they talk about fundraised income. You can use it interchangeably, so fundraised or contributed, and that falls into several different areas. Working from left to right on the screen there, so you have the tactical fundraising activity, stuff you do every day. It might be a donation box in your area, the welcome area of your organisation. It might be a poster on your toilet door saying contribute to keep this museum going. Some of those will become more engaged with you, and there's sort of people who are giving £1 if there was an opportunity to become a regular supporter. Some of you will have membership schemes or friend schemes. They might join. Some of them may go on to give more money if asked, and we'll talk about why it's so important to actually ask for the money in a bit. And they might become your major donors or largest donors as individuals. And some of those donors may go on to leave you a gift in their will. And we affectionately call that dead donors. Dead donors are also an area called trusts and foundations, which probably a number of you will have heard of. We'll talk through what trusts and foundations are, but they're usually where somebody has placed an amount of money, or an organisation has placed an amount of money into a charitable structure to give out as grants. So a little bit like the statutory income from government, but from a private source. And then you have corporates at the end. So you have your kind of living donors, philanthropists, your trusts and foundations, and your corporate sponsorship, which are all underpinned by this sort of tactical, regular fundraising activity that you carry out day to day, whether or not you realise it. And I think that one of the key things about fundraising is that it's everybody's job. And where we see organisations that fundraise really well, it's where there's a real shared understanding that it falls under everybody. Now, that doesn't mean everybody's going and asking people for money. It doesn't mean that everybody is frantically writing applications, although that's probably really helpful at the moment. But it might be that your colleagues who are welcoming people into the space, if you're open again and operating, are really on message about why it's important that people support you, that they're providing a wonderful service. It might be your trustees advocating for your organisation very clearly and articulately saying what you're about, why you're there and what's important. And this all comes to the case for support, which, as I said, we will touch on later, but making sure that everybody's on that same message and there's a really amplified sound around your organisation of who you are, why you're there, and why it's important that you continue to be there. So organisations tend to break their funding down for reporting purposes in terms of where their income comes from, where the income might change over time, and certainly if you look at this year as a snapshot, I think organisations' normal profiles of income are going to be really, really different to how they are usually. So I just wanted to sort of put out there, and you can put in the chat or you can speak. Do you have a sense of kind of where the income comes from in your museums in regular times, and where it might come from now, and where you think it's going to come from in the future? So any thoughts on any of that? It's interesting that in previous, if I'd have sort of ran this session 12 months ago, I would have said, you know, diversify your income, make sure you're not just relying on one income source. That's really important. And as Colin says, visitor services and commercial play a massive role in that. And actually the organisations that have done that well and have developed a number of different sources of income are the ones that are struggling at the moment, because the earned income has plummeted, obviously, with the lack of visitors. And things like tenants are more important than ever, because there isn't that sort of event activity happening. What I would say is, and we don't have a pandemic in sort of recent memory like this to compare to, but we do have things like the financial crash in 2008-9. And what we saw happening with charitable giving and with fundraising was quite similar in both times. So there's a long tail on fundraising to recover, and I think it'll be going for 18 months, 2 years after this as being a challenging time to fundraise. But it did recover, and individuals and corporates and trusts and foundations and statutory sources all continued funding to some respect. That might have changed during the financial crisis, how they gave or what they gave or why they gave it, but it was still around. And earned income levels that dropped significantly after the financial crash also recovered as well. So it's important to sort of have that glimmer of hope when you're thinking, how is this ever going to come to an end? it will come to an end, and diverse incomes will come back. You just need to hold your nerve and continue to pursue the sources of activity that can support you. Emma's just saying we're independent visitors where most of our money comes from. Yeah, now it's from grants and it'll need to go back to being visitors. Yeah, 100%. And Alice is adding, as things move online, we get to talk about ideas for filtering fundraising income. Yeah, absolutely. So shifting and pivoting what you've done. I think the risk when this first happened was saying everybody going, oh, everything's up in the air, it's complete pandemonium and chaos, let's just start again working out what we do. Actually, I would suggest just pausing for a moment, thinking don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There might be things in your strategies, in your forward plans, in your future development that are still very valid. They might just need to be done a little bit differently. They might need to be pivoted online. You might need to think about the order of things and when they happen. But often that sort of thinking that you've done up until this point isn't wasted, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. We'll talk very briefly about strategy towards the end of this session. This is sort of a classic example, really, of how organisations sometimes talk in their forward plans about growing their fundraised income over 3 years. It's often done in 3 or 4 years because that's the cycle of some of the major funders in terms of their regular funding. And you can see the red is trusts and foundations income, and then a little bit of business and a little bit of individuals. And so the sort of conventional strategy is grow your grant income, grow your trusts as much as possible. And if you can add on a couple of little bits of business support or individual giving over time, that's a great thing. Now, that's all well and good if you're the sort of organisation that has that trajectory. And really in this sector, I think we quite often revert to trusts and foundations and grants from statutory sources as being the main bulk of fundraised income. I would just urge you to really look at your organisations and think about how you're positioned and is that definitely the best route for you. And there's a real value to benchmarking. Have a look at organisations that are similar to you and have a look at how they're earning their money. We'll talk about looking on the Charity Commission's website a bit later on, but they all will publish accounts if they're a charitable organisation, and you can see how their income breaks down in those accounts. But it's good just to sense check. It's also important to remember, and for small organisations, trusts and foundations, don't get me wrong, are a very important part of the mix. But across the whole charity sector, individual giving is much, much higher than anything else in terms of the way people support. So have a think, if you've got a very engaged group of previously visitors, or now perhaps people who are engaging with you online or talking to you as individuals, are they being approached and asked for money? And do they really champion you and see a value in what you do and perhaps are in a position to support you? So it's very much around context. I've been in an organisation where I went to a board meeting and was told continually, you have to go for sponsorship, you have to go for sponsorship. That's the way to sort all this funding problems out. Red Bull will pick you up immediately. And actually that's all well and good. We were a sort of community arts organisation in quite a challenging part of the country, and it wasn't, Red Bull weren't going to be knocking on our door and saying, please let us sponsor your youth programme. But because I think fundraising is sometimes things that everybody thinks they know a bit about it, and so everyone can have quite strong opinions on how fundraising works, it's important to be able to base your strategy and base your thinking in some reality, to be able to challenge that sometimes, particularly if you've got people really pushing for one route. So let's talk through what these different types of funding are. And these are the kind of main types of funding that organisations tend to attract. The statutory funding, as I've said before, is funding from the government in some form. One of the largest ones is Arts Council England, who is supported by a payment from DCMS, the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, and also lottery funding as well. And I know Mirka will talk specifically about a lottery fund that they have later on. We've also got local authorities, whilst there is still money in local authorities, so I'm not sure how long that will go on for. And also the sort of National Lottery Fund, so what was previously Heritage Lottery Fund and the Big Lottery Fund, now National Lottery Heritage Fund and National Lottery Community Fund. They're not strictly statutory funders because they are lottery funded entirely, but I think they behave very much like a sort of government funding body. So I've lumped them in this one to put them together and to compare and contrast. And a lot of you will be familiar with the Heritage Fund, and Arts Council particularly do great work in supporting smaller organisations. I mean, I think with any statutory funding, if you're thinking about pursuing that, there's always the risk that to an extent they're at the pressure of the public purse. If the money comes from government and there's a change in government or there's a review in expenditure, you've got to think about that. They're often very specific in the way they're administered and the way that they're reported on, and systems like Grantium are in place to help capture the information that those bodies need to report back to government about what they're doing with their money. So sometimes statutory funding comes with quite a lot of admin requirements, and it's something to think about when you're looking at the time you've got and the resource you've got to service these grants. I think there was a time when statutory funders, as now, are sort of really top priority in terms of supporting grants with emergency funds and managing some of those government's funds and emergency things that they're doing at the minute. The Heritage Fund, Arts Council have all done those Cultural Recovery Fund programmes at the moment. But it's slightly different in that they're administering a government fund that's separate to their usual funding. So it's a slightly different set of behaviours and things they're looking for, and they're marking against criteria set by government as opposed to what perhaps their own sort of outline of how they assess grants is. So it's just something to think about. I think people often feel if they're very highly supported by statutory funds that they're safe, and there's the sort of famous story of Bernardo's, the children's charity, at one point was 90-something% funded by the government, and the trustees are all very happy with themselves, you know, this is really secure, but they're actually at huge risk if you've got that much funding coming from just one source, that if something happened to that government funding, they'd go bust. So it's important not to be over-reliant on any one type, and bear in mind the constraints associated with each type. We've mentioned trusts and foundations quite a bit. As I said, they're usually funds given by an organisation or an individual into a private trust to further a particular objective that that individual or organisation is interested in. There are about 10,000 in this country, and they give away about £2 billion per year. So there's a lot of money out there. They're charity bodies themselves, so there are often long processes in terms of how decisions can be made. And if you've written grant applications before, you'll know there's always associated things with deadlines and trustee meetings are coming back to you. So what happens is you submit your application. At the next board meeting, those applications are presented to the board, they decide who to fund and then come back to you. Now, if the board are only meeting twice a year, there's going to be quite a long lead-in time to getting that funding. That said, they're brilliant, and they're particularly good for socially led projects and socially led organisations, as a lot of them are set up around someone's own idea of kind of what's important to them and why they established it in the first place. There are, as a rule of thumb, the smaller the grant, the faster the process, hopefully. If you're looking for £1,000, there's things like the Persimmon Homes Foundation that you can apply online every month if you're near to somewhere where Persimmon Homes are building. It's a very, very quick online application. It takes about 15 minutes, and they do that every month and churn out some £1,000 supporters. If you're going for some of the larger cultural funders, I've just put a couple at the bottom of the slide. Paul Hamlin, you might have heard of, the Esme Fairbairn Foundation, the Garfield Weston Foundation. These are all larger charitable bodies with quite long processes, and if you're looking at raising 100k from them or 200k from them, you would expect it to take a little while, maybe up to 18 months, 2 years. I think quite often people feel really safe with trusts because they can write something quite quietly on their own and not have to worry about engaging with anybody. But I would push back a little bit and say, in my experience, trusts and foundations are as much about relationships as any other funder, and it's really important to think about how the person at the other end of the email where you sent the application, considering what their relationship is. I usually advise people to contact trusts and foundations in advance of putting an application in. Some will say, we don't want to talk to you on their website, and that's fine, respect that, don't harass them. But if they don't say that, or if they're open to a conversation, I'd absolutely recommend calling them, getting to know them, just running the idea past them that you're thinking of, and they will tell you that if the larger ones have grant managers that are paid to spend time with you and discuss whether or not your project or your work is the kind of thing that they might support, it saves you a load of time later on of writing a long application. Emma's just asked how you find those and where you see the relevant ones are. We'll touch on some databases that are available in a couple of slides, but actually the the sort of competitor analysis and benchmarking is another really good way to start finding new funds. So if you have a look at similar organisations, quite often on their support us page, there'll be a thank you to funders. Quite often, if you look on the Charity Commission website, as I said, you can search for a particular organisation, and in their accounts, they will list all the different funds they've had. The other good thing is if you know that there is a particular foundation that you're interested in and it doesn't tell you what amount you should apply for, which is often quite difficult, isn't it? Just apply for us and we'll decide how much we'll give you. If you look at they also have to report their accounts. They'll list who they've supported and they'll list the amounts of money that they've given to those organisations. So if you see 50 of their grants were for £3,000 and you're thinking of applying for 50,000, that's probably less likely than if you kind of get something that's roughly in the middle, roughly equivalent. And the vet's just added a link to the Museum of London and London Museum Development of some additional resources of trusts and foundations and their availability. There is also a body set up in a number of areas of the country called Community Foundation, where the London Community Foundation is great actually, and holds a number of smaller trusts and foundations. They quite often administer trusts and foundations on behalf of small family trusts, little tiny trusts that don't necessarily have a website or the profile for you to know about. And if you go on the London Community Foundation, you can search by your local authority and you can read which types of grants they're holding for which area and the application process for them. And again, they're a really helpful funder in my experience. I've had money through the London Community Foundation before and have been very open to calling up and saying, look, I'm not quite sure where to start. I've got this amazing project. Can I just chat to you and let me know if any of the funds that you're holding are something that it might appeal? Build that relationship. If you're holding events online, if you're doing any kind of thought pieces or in conversations with, or meet the curators at your organisations, or meet anybody else for that matter, invite some trusts and foundations into the conversation. Invite them to see things. Invite them to talk to you. If you're back in your buildings and when we're in a sort of safe time, invite them down. Make sure that they're on your guest list and woo them a little bit and get to know them. The whole point of all of this, again, is sort of building that good relationship and ensuring that when they see an application from you, they're not going, well, who on earth's that? They go, oh yeah, actually, we've been talking to them for a while. Oh, we went to that great event. Oh, wow, their collection's really amazing. So you're just trying to warm it up a little bit. In terms of the way you choose to communicate as well, think about how you're using things like social media, marketing. Are you writing blogs? Are you writing thought pieces that could get under the eye of some of these things? And again, raising your profile, and not your profile necessarily linked to an event or linked to a collection, but what does your museum say about the world? What's your worldview? What are you experts on? And how can you ensure that people who are looking for information recognize you as an expert? Is that if the press have a particular story, are they coming to you to ask for a comment? Again, just every little thing you do, drip feeding away at raising your profile and making people more aware of who you are and what you're about. With individuals, it's really all about engaging who you know, engaging with people who share that kind of worldview that I just mentioned with you, and bringing them close to your organisation. There are lots of different opportunities with individuals, as I say. There was a survey done by the Charity Aid Foundation, I think, at the beginning of lockdown, and whilst some people surveyed were saying, you know, we can't afford to give to charity at that time, there was a significant, I think 22% of people surveyed said they would want to and would try to give more to charity at this time. And again, I've been really pleasantly surprised with the amount of individual giving at all levels that's really gone on through that time. It's been really lovely. Major donors, as I say, is a sort of little bit of the sort of fantasy in everybody's book that they've got somebody with a big checkbook that happens to be hanging around in their museums that you can access. Major donors take lots of time to cultivate. If you're looking to get some money in the next 2 months and you don't have an overtly wealthy patron who's floating around your being, don't necessarily think of it as a quick fix. Major donors also there is no HMRC definition as to what a major donor is. So I've worked in organisations where £500 is the sort of significant gift and the red carpet is rolled out and it's all bells and whistles. And I've worked in organisations where it's 10, 15, 20 grand is the first kind of moment that people go, oh, you're a major donor for us. So you can really set that yourself with what's important. Memberships and friends schemes, one-off donations. These are all kind of, there's a sort of now sometimes contested tree about individual giving where you sort of have a bottom line of lots of people giving £1, then a few of those people might join a membership scheme or give regularly, and then a few more people will become larger donors, and a few less people again will leave you a gift in their will. And that's contested because of the hierarchy that suggests, you know, that major donors are worth more to the organisation than little. And I don't necessarily agree with that, but I do think that you want to be asking lots of people for little amounts and often, and in a really light touch way, so it doesn't feel overbearing. It's quite consistent messaging. So if you're on your website, what does your donate, do you have a donate now button? Do you have a support us page? What's that saying? Is that saying the same stuff that you're saying in real life? Is it saying the same thing as it's saying in your museum if you go into that space? So having a think about nice simplistic messaging. And at this time particularly, I think people want really human, transparent, empathetic conversations. People aren't looking for you to say, do you know what, we're doing so amazingly at the moment, it's all good, don't worry about us. They want people to say, yeah, we're having a tough time, how are you doing? And having that dialogue. We need your help. Absolutely look after the people around you in the first instance, but if you can help us out, we see that you like us, please do support us. And making sure that you actually ask people, which sounds incredibly obvious, but sometimes is something that fundraisers don't do. They paint a beautiful story of why they need the money, and they paint a beautiful story of what they'll do with the money, but they don't actually ever ask for the money. And I've done it myself as well, and sort of left a conversation and gone, this is weird, he hasn't given me any cash. Oh, I didn't actually say I could have some money now. So make sure you're asking. And sometimes that's something that you need to work with your colleagues and teams to make, because it can feel a bit weird if you're not used to doing it. But there is absolutely nothing wrong with asking for money. It's about Indu Rubishang, the Kiln Theatre, described herself as being kind of quite scared of fundraising, and then she realised it was the sort of act of bringing somebody who's really passionate about something into something that she's passionate about. And once she'd made that connection, it was really straightforward, because actually you're asking them to get involved in something they already love. That's not as hard an ask as asking somebody cold. I think the art of good individual giving is find people that share those views with you. So it's much harder to walk out onto the street outside where you're living and going, can you give my museum a tenner, than it is to finding places where those people are anyway, that are already engaged and value what you do and understand the importance of what you do. And if you're from an organisation that has quite a commercial sort of side to it and less fundraising, as I said before, I came into fundraising through a commercial role, and I really struggled with the concept of, hang on, there's not a product here to sell, I'm selling a lifestyle. How is that going to be appealing to everybody? Once it sort of clicked in my head that it is just the other side of the sales coin, and instead of selling a physical something, you're selling a value, or you're selling a belief, or you're selling a united vision for how you want the world to be better. It's a much easier thing to talk about. Fundraisers often talk about giving to me, the charity, and it's less appealing actually. Then you're wanting to connect as a fundraiser the person who's interested in your charity with what your charity's doing, and bring those two things together. Fund me to buy some new light bulbs for my museum is far less appealing and emotive, unless you've got a very niche person, than it is to say, fund me to continue keeping the lights on for these amazing education programs that we run. And sort of connecting it and bringing that together. So it's about the you as a person and you as a beneficiary, horrible charity word, and bringing those two things together as much as possible. Corporate fundraising, which is really the one I thought would suffer significantly during COVID, and has, of course, to an extent, but not as much as I thought, is raising money from business. And these sort of four main ways that people do that. So sponsorship is where it is very transactional. There is usually a contract. It's VATable for those finance bods out there. It's an arrangement with a business. So they will give you some money in order to do X, Y, and Z. That might be put a logo on something. It might be to name something. It might be to support a particular program of work or a particular collection. It's quite transactional, and there's usually a benefit to the corporate organisation in terms of exposure, new audiences, space to entertain people. It could be any of those things. Corporate philanthropy, on the other hand, is sort of the altruistic giving of not having a tangible benefit for the company. And it's where companies, you might hear them talk about corporate social responsibility, where companies have a set of values that they also adhere to. And again, much like the individuals, it's about looking for companies that share that value with you, have the same belief system as you, and bringing them in together. in COVID, I think, I don't know if you're the same, but I've got a number of companies that I wouldn't work with again, just because, you know, they've messed you about, or they haven't, just in life, not in fundraising, but I mean sort of booking hotels that won't refund your money or transfer your booking at the start of lockdown, and it just made me really grumpy about them. And I think that's happening a lot, and people are really seeing the sort of the values and the ethics behind some big high street firms and businesses more broadly. And that's certainly becoming apparent in corporate fundraising. I think corporates are really keen to show what their ethics and their values and their beliefs are. And a partnership with your museum might be the perfect way for them to do that, and to realise that, to show that they're helping a community, to show that they believe in the stories behind your collection, to help them connect with local people. So corporate philanthropy is quite an interesting one. Corporate membership I've left on there, although it tends to be losing its wham, in part because there are rules from the Financial Conduct Authority about how much money businesses can spend on entertaining, but also, so it's like an individual membership scheme. Companies sign up, they might have access to private views, they might have access to particular glitzy events. It still works well in large organisations. I'm sure Tate, they have a really active corporate membership scheme, but they're in quite a different position potentially in terms of the type of spaces that they can run that type of activity in. And finally, in-kind support, which is where there isn't any funding changing hands, but people are giving you something else. In-kind support is very helpful at the moment. People often think, you know, it's a bit of a waste of time. I need cash now. I don't have time to worry about in-kind support at the moment. But actually, there are three things. Firstly, that in-kind support often becomes cash later on. So you might start a relationship with somebody who will give you, X amount of paint to paint your museum walls, and that later goes on to being financial support. Secondly, if you look at the money that you need to raise and you look at where you're spending that, and there's something that's very tangible that could be an in-kind thing, like light bulbs, like paint, that's budget relieving actually. So it takes the pressure off you having to raise more grants if you can bring in-kind support. And then finally, sometimes the in-kind support is worth way more than the cash that you're asking for as well. So my example of that is an organisation I sit on the board of, and we would be trying to source money to pay for PR for the organisation, £500, £1,000 or something. And a PR firm locally said, we can't do that, we haven't got any cash, but we'll give you a pro bono free day a month of PR support. And that support was worth far more than the 500 quid or so that we were asking for them. It raised our profile, it made us obvious to funders, it made us obvious to individuals, it increased our visitor numbers. So having a think about what strategically is the benefit of chasing something that's not going to pay very much, but actually the service that is worth way more. I know a number of organisations who've done that with IT support. People asked for like £1,000 to support their computer systems, and in fact have ended up getting lots of new laptops and equipment, and it's been worth significant amounts and really taken the organisation forward. So it's something not to discount immediately and think about. And then finally, other fundraising. I mean, we could go on and on. This could be a whole session in itself, but I've just listed a few things there. So legacy and in memoriam fundraising I've talked about a bit, which is gifts in wills. People get very nervous about talking about legacy giving in this sector, and if you look at some of our colleagues in the sort of mainstream charity sector, particularly the big health charities, unsurprisingly, British Heart Foundations, your lung cancer charities, they do a lot of in memoriam giving because it's much more easy for them to talk about, perhaps, given in the subject of what they do. There was also a sort of splurge at the beginning of lockdown of people going, oh, it's a pandemic, we can't possibly talk about wills. And actually, I don't know if you've noticed, I've seen a lot more advertising for legacy giving. And I think if it's done sensitively, you can run a legacy campaign in a period of crisis. You need to be careful about the positioning of it. And I would always suggest that legacy giving is done alongside your other individual giving. So there are ways you can support us by giving £1, by joining our membership scheme, by leaving us a gift in the will. So it feels quite normalised and it's drip fed in little and often, rather than feeling this big thing that you're building up to talking about death. There are different moments in people's lives, pandemics and crises being one of them, where health and people's mortality is more of the moment than others. Usually when someone buys their first house, they redo a will, when they retire, when they get married, and in sort of significant social factors like this. So having a think, I don't know if you run a lot of weddings in regular times in your spaces, Is that a kind of moment to kind of have an in memoriam leaflet or a flyer, or possibly not at the wedding because that's pretty dark, but to just have some of that material and collateral available for people to think about. And the other way to normalise in memoriam giving and legacy giving is to find someone who has pledged to support you through a will, and if they're comfortable, for them to talk about it. So it's a lot more powerful to have a short video of someone saying, I think this museum's the greatest thing ever, I want future generations to enjoy it, and I've pledged. That's way more powerful than you or I saying that to people. So having a look within your existing donors and funders at who your champions might be, and that works right across all of the funding mix, actually. The digital and crowdfunding stuff, I mean, as I say, we've seen an awful lot of it. I think crowdfunding has been brilliant during this time. My sort of caveat to crowdfunding is that it isn't a quick fix of sticking something online and coming back 30 days later and you having a significant body of money. That has happened, don't get me wrong, but on the whole, that's not how it works. If you've ran a crowdfunding campaign, you'll know it's quite all-consuming. It's like anything else. You need to have activity happening every day. You need to think really carefully about the platform that you choose to crowdfund on, if that's just giving or Virgin Money or something else, in terms of whether they take a fee from you and whether or not they pay out if you don't get to your target, a sort of all or nothing setup. I think Just Giving is very straightforward. It's an easy thing to manage. I've done a few campaigns on there. Crowdfunder, I think, is another one, although I'm not endorsing anyone particularly. But it's worth, if you're interested in crowdfunding, just having a look out there at different platforms that are around. And finally, social investment, which potentially isn't for the now, but just to have in mind that there are a number of specific organisations, finance organisations, that will support charitable bodies with preferential rates or loans that are having social impact measured as much as they are the kind of impact of the loan itself on your finance. This is something that, as a cultural sector, I think we tend to shy away from a little bit, but actually in SMEs and startups and entrepreneurship sectors, it's much more usual to have sort of loan arrangement and as part of the finance mix. So I just added that there to keep that in mind when you're thinking about all the different methods of how you might fundraise. So that was an enormously whistle-stop tour of that. Apologies for being but hopefully you can see there's quite a lot of different options out there. And in terms of what's for you, well, think about what is it that you want to fund? Well, what resource do you have to access it? And how long have you got? Those were the three questions that I would frame your thinking with. As I said, if you're looking to cultivate someone who's got £50,000 to donate that to your organisation, but you need it in a month, I probably wouldn't start with major giving. That's something that you can think much further down the line and be strategic about. If you think, do you know what, I need £10,000 now and I'm going to need £60,000 next year from trusts and foundations, you want to think what you can do in 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. At the 3-month point, you want to do those little short, fast turnaround, 12-week applications processes that you can just bang out and get some out there and get things happening, so you get a little bit of money coming in now. At the same time, you might be thinking about those relationships with those slightly bigger funders that you want to have in a year's time. So your action at 3 months is, let's contact a couple now, tell them who we are, say hello, ask if they're interested in our organisation. So you can sort of build a plan backwards from where you want to get to. But it's important to recognise that every type of fundraising really has some sort of resource required to go into it. It's not easy fix. And I think quite often there's the misconception that fundraisers have little black books and they just whip them out and then they call somebody and then there's loads of money, and that's not the case. It used to be, and it still is in a couple of very large institutions that are very well funded by long-standing, say, individual givers or relationships. But on the whole, it takes time to cultivate relationships, doesn't it, regardless of whether you're asking them for money or something else. So have a think about that. And in terms of how you might be finding stuff, as I've said already, the sort of current funders and a competitor analysis is a really good way to go. If you think that sort of 6 degrees of separation idea of who do you know, that's a good exercise to do with your teams. It's a good exercise to do with your boards, and say, actually, and it might not be a sort of rich individual even, it might be somebody who can open the door to something. It might be somebody who is on the board of something. It might be somebody who is connected to somebody or is neighbours with somebody who's on the board of something, or a funder or a business. Somebody's brother, mother, sister might work for a particular company that is very passionate about the work that you do or the collection that you do. So maybe work out where you want to get to, because it's quite a difficult conversation to say, can you tell me everybody you know, please? Actually, you could say, we're looking for a particular corporate funder that's interested in our collection about X, Y, and Z. Do you have any contacts that you think you could connect it to? And just give them a bit of time to work through some of those connections. You'd be surprised often at sort of how people connect to things. If you do this and you're particularly looking for individuals, quite often people say, do you know any rich people? Well, that's difficult, but sometimes if you say to them, I want somebody who, I don't know, goes to museums a lot, who pays kind of high level membership at one of the national museums, I want somebody who's going to be quite active in supporting my education program, and then start to draw a little picture for them about the sort of people that you think might be interested in you, and help them work through their contacts. On that Charity Commission website I've mentioned a few times, you've got the search facility to be able to look at people's accounts. That's immensely helpful and strangely addictive in terms of finding sort of niche funders that perhaps you're not aware of, but also just seeing the kind of lay of the land. And if you have an organisation that's very similar to you, that is funding from all the same sources as you, that there's a competition issue there, isn't there, about how much people can give to very similar causes. So have a think about how you might diversify your funding, as well as learn from the funders that are already supporting organisations like you. And then those larger bodies like Arts Council England and National Lottery Heritage Fund obviously have a lot of information on their website. The London Museum Development Network, of course, also have a sea of resources available to help you think through things. Local community foundations I've mentioned as an interesting signpost to come in. And Funding Central is one of many different platforms that is a database of trusts and foundations. It's free if your organisation earns less than 100k per year, and then it goes up incrementally beyond that. And with a database like that, you can put in the parameters of the type of trust funding you might want. So, I know, young people, West London, less than £10,000, and it will filter out for you all of the different things. You can also set up automatic email notifications when things change with their funds. One final thing on where to find funding is that a lot of the original ways that organisations funded things have changed at the moment because of COVID. There's been different priorities. There's ring-fenced funds, there's funds moving about, there's funders who have paused. So if somebody says to you, you know, a few years ago, I'd heard of this fund, it was really great, and you think it doesn't sound like me, it doesn't sound like my organisation, don't dismiss it immediately. It's worth just having a quick look to see how their priorities have changed. The Esme Fairbairn Foundation have just launched a whole new grant-making strategy with some different areas, for example, which are quite different. The Bearing Foundation, which historically supported a grant-making strategy around older people, has now moved into mental health in the last 12 months. So there's lots of things shifting and moving all the time, and it's worth checking back in. Similarly, if you've had conversations with funders in the past and you know your organisations have had a funder that says no to you, sometimes with a reframed COVID messaging, it might not be a no anymore. And I've heard of a number of examples of organisations that have gone to grant funders that have said no in the past, who've now changed their mind and said, actually, yeah, you're doing really important work, and it's important that during this period you continue, so you can engage with us. So again, maybe talk to colleagues who've done it before if you have access to them. If you don't have access to people who've fundraised before in your organisation, look at your own accounts and look back via the Charity Commission website if needs be at where supports come from, and have a think about why did that person stop, or why has that funder funded me every year for 10 years and now I haven't seen anything for 5 years. Just work through some of the different options. Just a couple more slides and we'll have a cup of coffee. I wanted to sort of move it a little bit into the now, I guess, and some of the pressures. And this survey was done by Historic England at the start of lockdown, but through this, they're really talking about the heritage sector, 90% of which are reporting a high or moderate risk of their long-term viability. 37% of organisations surveyed said they couldn't survive for more than 6 months, and 11% thought they couldn't survive for any more than 2 months. Excuse me. And to that end, there is a real short-term challenge. The competition for funding from all sources is higher than ever. And as we mentioned earlier in the introductions, the situation that you get your funding now might be very, very different in 6 months' time. So I think it's important to try and control the controllables. you know that you're going to need certain things. You know you're going to need to pay your electricity bill in 12 months regardless. You don't necessarily know that you'll need to run an education program in the way you run it now in 12 months time. So think about what the priorities are for funding, think of what the non-negotiables are, and focus on securing funds for those first. In tech and in tech development, there's a system of minimum viable product, it's called, where you develop something just to the point where you've got enough to make it work and you can test it, and then you get some feedback and you develop it some more. And I think this is an opportunity for our sector to sort of pull in what's absolutely important to us as a museum, what's absolutely important to the way we work, that we have to deliver to be viable, and then let's focus on that for a little bit actually. It's also a great way if you're doing lots of things, and a number of you may think, you know, we've got these projects that we deliver that we think, why are we doing this? We've been doing it for years and years and years, and it doesn't really further our mission. It doesn't really bring us any money. It costs us more than we're, I can see some pained nods there of people who've been through this. Maybe this is the opportunity to go, do you know what? We're having to reassess the viability of everything and free yourself and liberate yourself of some of these things that have historically been sort of hangovers from other things. And there has been quite a lot of conversation with colleagues in the heritage sector that I've had about just how appropriate even is it to fundraise at the moment. And particularly if you've not fundraised before, I think there can be a real risk of thinking, well, is this okay to be doing when we've got a food bank that's struggling to operate on our doorstep, or when there are serious social care challenges around the corner from our museum? I think quite often, for me anyway, the case is yes, and I can really see the argument for the role our sector plays in society and society coming back from this. And I think others share that view as well. So don't feel like you're not as important as some of the other causes. Everybody's playing a different role, and a number of individual donors and certainly funders fund more than one organisation. So don't feel like just because the food bank is asking Mrs. Smith for a £5 donation that you're not able to do that yourself as well. That's quite all right, and they can make a decision about whether that's appropriate or not. As I said, your supporters and your audiences are really critical right now, and they're, even if they can't be with you in person, they're still those people that will really engage with you. And I think if your organisations haven't already reached out and spoken to any of those, it's a good idea to try and do that in some way, whether that's just to check in to say, how are you? People want human contact, people want empathy, people want you to acknowledge that they're having a tough time as well, and that's all right. There are some really nice examples. Galway Festival in Ireland, which I've become a bit obsessed with of late, have really nice wording on their website about, do you know what, we know you're having a really tough time at the moment. If you can look after us as well, once you've looked after yourselves, we'd really appreciate a donation. I just think it's very human. It's very referencing what's going on in a way that doesn't feel like you're shooing yourself into this sort of COVID response position. And the messaging we'll come back to and thinking about that, but demonstrating an awareness of the situation and why your organisation requires financial support is really important to be clear. Some parts of your work might also more naturally lend themselves to fundraising. So it might be conceptually where the people that you work with, or perhaps people who are engaging with a certain outreach programme, are being adversely affected by coronavirus than something else. And so it just sits itself in a more natural kind of, we're helping socially more broadly this community as an ask. It might be that you have a very tangible ask to do with making social distancing work in your spaces and being able to have the correct equipment to do that. And that's sort of something that everybody has a framework of thought and language and vernacular about at the moment. So again, something to think about in terms of positioning yourself right now. And more broadly, I mean, I think you guys will have more of a sense of this being right in it, of course. But it feels to me, at least, like some of the larger funders and the statutory funders now who've got out that COVID emergency funding have moved from emergency into recovery. And a number of the funds are starting to reposition themselves to think of the Cultural Recovery Fund funding things through till March. Now funders are starting to think, right, how do we fund things beyond March? Museums are reopening and indeed closing with COVID-19 measures and new COVID-19 guidance coming out all the time. Obviously the tiering system has recently impacted yourselves with a change of tier in London. There is new guidance, as you know, on everything from face coverings and rules of 6, and your visitors are impacted again. But there are also new funds becoming available. So as I said, this Esme Fairbairn grant, which has opened up across its new strategic direction. For larger organisations, there's the Garfield Western Cultural Fund, which has opened now, and also the Charities Aid Foundation announced yesterday a new emergency grant for charitable bodies. So there is still lots going on, and there's still things to keep on top of within a changing landscape, and with the understanding, as I think we all are, that there are things that we can't impact or change within the next 6 months, the next 12 months. So trying to give yourself a bit of a break, to think about, again, what you can control and what you can't control, giving yourself a bit of space and time to review the options, to work out exactly where you are now, and to think, what is the most valuable use of my time at the moment? Actually, is that glorious event that I was going to put on in 12 months, and I spend hours every day redoing the risk assessment and moving it back by 3 weeks and back by 3 weeks and back by 3 weeks? Is that definitely the best use of my time? Or do we say, do you know what, I don't know what's going to happen in 12 months, I'm going to start focusing on asking my individuals who engage with us for money in a better way, a more clear way? So just because you've always done it, and because it feels good to be, and I'm currently organising an event that's I've done about 5 times, so I'm no better, and have just stopped and gone, actually, why am I doing this? I don't know what's going to happen. Park it. Let's move on to something else. And just to end this, really, that I don't know if you've heard of Cresswell Crags. They're a site in Northamptonshire that has a museum and an outdoor space, really beautiful outdoor space. It's prehistoric heritage. They were very close to insolvency at the beginning of lockdown, and I really, really liked the way they responded. They told people, first of all, in a very clear, straightforward way, look, this is challenging for us at the moment. These are the risks we're facing, and if we close, this is the result of that. You won't have this historic landscape maintained. You won't have access to these collections, and what that means for society is X, Y, and Z. And they did that really clearly through a tiny little video that was embedded at the beginning of their website when you went onto it. It was very, very clear. It was very, very emotive. It made me feel something, which we'll come back to after a coffee. And it made me want to give. They did design a poster competition to save the crags for children. So they engaged their visitors, they engaged their supporters, and got them to advocate for them, because everybody wants to share their children's work on social media. So it had a really lovely ripple effect. And they started a crowdfunding campaign for £50,000, which very quickly, within the first couple of weeks, amassed sort of 25, 26 grand, I think, and continues to bring in funding. They also gave a very, very simple message, which they pinned at the top of their social media feeds and on their website, about how to give. It was all the information you needed in one tiny little set of Twitter characters or whatever, and that made it really simplistic for people to engage with. So they weren't having to go through 10 pages of signing up all their information before the opportunity to give £1 arose. It was sort of a text this number now, very, very quick and easy. They've since gone on to receive Cultural Recovery Fund grants. I think they got 440,000 from the National Lottery Heritage Fund, which is brilliant news. And what I thought was really lovely is if you look on their Twitter feed now, they're thanking the fund, of course, for the money coming in, but they're also saying, and we're not forgetting about you individual donors, thank you so much, because you funding us in the first instance got us to the point when we could actually apply for this. And I think that's hugely powerful and really empowering for people who've supported it as well, who might feel like, oh, it's saved now, they've got their 440k, there's no need to worry anymore. In fact, there is, as we said, that only takes you so far, it only takes you to March, so it's important to keep that momentum going and to keep talking to people all the time. Does anybody have any questions or comments or observations before we have a cup of coffee? Yeah, there are a few different things you can think about. Is there a charity that you can partner with that could manage something on your behalf, or joint fundraise for you or something like that? Yeah, there's no requirement for you. There's no requirement for you to be a charity to fundraise, actually, at all. Yeah. It's really important that you're explicit that you aren't a charity, because it starts to get into murky waters if you start sort of saying you'll use it for charitable things and you're not really a charity. There are various platforms that will let you do it, regardless of whether or not you're registered. There are trusts and foundations, although a lot less, who will support non-charities, but they will support CICs, they will support local authorities sometimes. Again, it's worth a conversation, because they see an application from London Borough of Hackney, sorry, Anna. That's my reference point. And they think, what on earth, when actually they don't see in the first instance, it's the museum that's applying for money. So it's definitely worth talking to them. And the other thing you can work with is there's an organisation called the Philanthropy Foundation, and they are a charity which will set up an account for organisations that aren't charities and then manage the funds for them. You pay them a fee of whatever, I think it's a small percentage of whatever sits in the account, and they do the reporting, they do the kind of administering of it all for you from a charitable perspective. But it gives bodies a kind of charitable vehicle to direct individual giving, to direct other types of support. That's a good bet. It also means that you're eligible for gift aid on those donations. So usually, in my experience at least, individuals have come to my organisations and said, can we apply as you for this funding? So the individual is using the charitable body to leverage in support, which then goes to work on the charitable body, whatever that is. I think there are sometimes challenges with that happening in isolation. If you've got other people who are in conversation with funders that you perhaps you're not aware of, and then you're suddenly competing with yourself, or you can only have one application per year to a particular, so it requires some talking through. But I mean, I would suggest if someone's keen to help and it's a project that fits within your mission and vision and values and isn't going to derail what you do, then it's worth having a conversation and exploring what they might mean by that. There are some grants that there's the sort of what they call Winston Churchill Fellowship, which is a grant that is only given to individuals in order to further their work and research. It's quite often a travel-based grant. So you sometimes get people coming to you saying, I've got this funding to do some R&D. There's just developing a creative practice, which is again for individuals and R&D as well, so that it might be that they're able to access those funds in a way that you as an organisation wouldn't. But it needs to be about the individual and not about the organisation at the end of the day, that grant. I think place and sort of sense of place is really important in fundraising, right across everything. I mean, and again, with individual giving, there's been a real trend towards giving to place-based initiatives.
Right.
About places. I think there's so much chaos going on in the world at the moment, isn't there, that people find it a bit overwhelming to give to a global movement. Sometimes it's just a bit like, oh, or actually if you can see the reality of something that's happening as a result of your donation on your doorstep, it feels a lot tangible. I think in London, you're at risk sometimes of being assumed as being ultra wealthy patrons and you need to fundraise because you're surrounded by wealth and opulence all the time. Lewisham certainly isn't that, in my experience. No. I used to have a lot of challenging conversations with trusts and foundations who weren't based nearby, going, but you're London, why on earth would you need our support? You can't have that much need, which sounds like amazing, and I'm quite surprised that I was still having that conversation at the point that I was having it. But you sometimes need to paint the picture and be a bit more explicit. The other thing to look at the profile of your place. So with Lewisham as an example, again, it doesn't have a sort of built-up corporate infrastructure in the way that some of the other London boroughs have. So there was the hospital, was a kind of major employer, but it's tricky, particularly at the moment, to fundraise from hospitals, and I wouldn't recommend it. There were lots and lots and lots of small local business, and it's a real thriving kind of startup borough. We shifted our corporate fundraising towards engaging with those businesses. We ran a campaign called A Theatre Trip for Every Child, which was about getting every 4-year-old in that borough of Lewisham to go to the theatre for the first time to see a show, and it be in Lewisham, and that was really key. And we used that as a kind of hook for local business that was saying, you've chosen to start your business here. This is clearly important to you as a borough as well. We're potentially showing kids the amazing stuff going on in Lewisham that could be your future employee in the sort of long term. Can you give us 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 quid? So we moved away from having big corporate 25 grand sponsorships and started saying, have you got £100 to support this campaign? And it was really grassrootsy, and it worked well. It worked really well. It's still going. I think in the first year we raised about 25,000, and it was quite intensive, walking around the streets into local shops and going, have you got £20 to give me, please? But it was worth it, and the sort of sense of community it created has really, I think, continued with the Albany and continued to be a sort of groundswell of support. I think there's a real value to looking sort of again at your museums or sites and going, what does this mean to my local community? what's important. If my museum shuts tomorrow, what's the impact? Does it have an impact on the local community? It might not do. It might be your collection that's more specific. Or I always say to museums, you know, pick yourselves up and plonk yourselves in another part of the country. Would you be the same organisation? Some would, and then finding that community, I think, is more about interest in the collection. And it might be an international community interested in a very specific collection, or it might be that your museum has a really tangible relationship with its locale, and you can start to think about what messaging you use and the conversations you have with people based around, again, that sense of value and that sense of what's important to people and what's important to you. That's all good fundraising is, I think. A colleague of mine, Fern, who delivers an application writing workshop for us, talks about it as being like ships in the night, funders and fundees. We often want to tell lots of people things that they don't really want to know, and the funder also wants to know lots of things that we don't think are that relevant to them as the fundraiser. So it's very important to be very clear with your fundraising about what you want to tell and what they want to hear as well. A case for support is, I guess, a kind of central, pivotal document that is used to inform all of your fundraising across your organisation. It's where all of the different messages hang off. And sort of, you might have a case for support that's specific to a project. You might have a case for support that's specific to your whole organisation. Ideally, it's something that's written down and that people know, and that people can not necessarily recite word for word, but can give you the gist of it in a couple of key points. I used to be on the board of an organisation where the chief exec would text the kind of 3 main things they wanted us to talk about when we went to events. That was so useful at keeping me on script and stopping me waffling, and also ensuring that everybody was saying the same thing and the voice of what we wanted was really amplified, as I was saying before. Quite often people write beautiful case for supports that are 30, 50, 100 pages long, and they spend an awful long time doing it, and nobody cares, I have to say. If it's too long, people aren't going to want to read it. And if you get bored reading your organisation's case for support, I would question whether it's the right thing to be using to inform your fundraising. Other common problems with it, these are from a book called The Influential Fundraiser, which is written by a chap called Bernard Ross and Claire Siegel, who run a company called the Management Centre. And they talk about the risks of case for support, including being very jargony. And I think we're quite bad in the cultural sector at using jargon and acronyms and abbreviating things. And if you start using that in the language that you fundraise with, nobody's going to get it, and nobody's going to understand when you say, ACE supported me to do this, so you should. Well, unless you're in the arts sector, ACE doesn't mean anything to anybody. NLHF, NL, whatever the other one's called, all of these kind of random acronyms that we use all the time. And we often sometimes it's important to talk in the language that your funder talks in as well. So if your funder is calling the people benefiting from the work beneficiaries, use that word too. But if they're calling it participants, people try and match what you're writing, and so people can understand what you're talking about. And finally, it can be too internally focused as well. So if your case for support is largely about the challenges your organisation has had in moving offices from one part of the building to another, and the walls falling down, and it's not a great time, again, not particularly engaging or emotive. You want to think about a story that's persuasive. A case for support is educational to a point, but it's not an educational overview of your organisation. So you don't want to spend reams and reams of pages saying in 1865, this museum was set up to do X, Y, and Z. That's another role within your communications mix. Your fundraising language and rhetoric is to persuade people to support you. So make sure you're writing in a way that allows people to do that. And so the idea of the case for support is that you have a kind of centralized bank of message that says who you are and what you're about. And then you can hang the specific stuff like a corporate angle off that language, your individual giving language off that angle, your trusts language off that angle. For those of you who don't know if you have one or do not have one, I think it's definitely something to have a think about. It'll make your fundraising much easier because you're not going to be trying to recreate the story every single time you do fundraising. This isn't about copying and pasting one thing into the next application, necessarily, because there also lies madness, because you need to research and you need to respond to what funders are looking for. But having a central story is really key. Some organisations have their case for support online for people to access. I don't know if they still do, but the People's History Museum in Manchester used to have a case for support on their website, on their supporters page. But I'll have a see if I can think of any others and share them with Elizabeth to distribute after this session. So ideally, I mean, a good case for support has three things. Again, from the Influential Fundraiser book, it's about a clear and widely owned and understood vision of what's to be achieved. It's a defined and costed list of resources that are needed to achieve that. So quite often, if you're asking me, can I borrow 50 quid? Can I have 50 quid for something? And I say, what do you need it for? And you go, oh, this and that. It's going to be a lot less meaningful than if you say, I need to buy X, Y, and Z, and this is what it costs to do it, and that's why I need £50. And ideally, it's aimed at a cluster of donors who have the potential to meet that express need. So you might have a really strong story about how your museum is changing the world, or changing your locale, or changing your society, or the collection is so valuable internationally, but that needs to mean something to the donors. Again, it's sort of connecting the outputs of that with the donor themselves. And where you position those bits of messaging are really important. So if you're saying we need to raise £1 million this year to keep going, and you're plastering that on the side of your donation box and it says give us £1 towards our £1 million goal, it feels a bit meaningless for the donor potentially. It feels like, what difference is my quid going to make? And actually, if you're looking at bigger trusts and you're funding for £100,000 grants, £1 million seems a much more achievable tenth of that you can help with. So it's sort of framing it and changing it and thinking about it. When you're asking somebody for a donation in a donation box, for example, perhaps you want it to be, we need to raise a lot of money to do this and that. £10,000 supports us to keep this visitor centre open for you to, or that keeps this retail function going, keeps our cafe, or keeps our collection. Again, it contextualises it. £1 out of 10,000 is a lot more meaningful than £1 out of £1 million. People feel like they can engage with it and they feel able to share their money because it's going to make an impact. We do lots of work with organisations about developing their case for support, and I quite often start with asking them these 6 questions. I think this is a really good exercise to take away from today and do with your colleagues and see what they say, because quite often people will say very different things, and again, you want to try and unify as much as possible the messaging. So what is the overall mission and activity, either of your organisation or your project, and keep drilling down, keep asking them why. So you're a museum, okay, but about what? What's the core value of it? Why are you there? What's going on? What's the need? What is the need for your museum, either in your locale or for your community? What's the point of you being there, and how do you know that? How have you evidenced that that is the need? Our education programme is really important because we have to work with children across the borough of Bexley. Okay, but who says the children in Bexley aren't already really engaged? Where is that evidence and resource? And is there a specific part of that community that you want to work with more than others? So be really distinctive. You want to stand out. When I worked for the London Borough of Hackney and we delivered small grants to organisations, I cannot tell you the amount of people who said they were the best youth theatre in East London applying for money. They can't all have been the best youth theatre. Where I funded things, where they said we're the best young people's theatre working with this particular part of the community, or children coming out of care, or those aged between 6 and 9 in after school clubs. It's really distinctive, and I could understand what was going on. What's your track record? So you want funders to have a sort of positive feeling that you're going to look after their money well, and a good way of demonstrating that is that you've held funds before. You've been able to talk about holding public funds or managing funds, or if you haven't done that particularly and you haven't fundraised very much, perhaps it's about how you currently deliver what you do and how other people who invest in you, either spending money on events or sponsoring you, are seeing a value in what you do. So just demonstrating back to them that you can be really trusted. What your plans are, what you want to do next, what's going on, and why you're doing it, sort of what's that response about, what the outputs and outcomes might be. So this is very fundy language, but output being something like a number, 10 sessions with this particular group, or 14 new items to add to our collection, or 3 new members of staff. And outcomes are the kind of change that you want to see as a result of the work that you're doing. So that might be about the 10 workshops that I'm going to do with young people in my museum are going to increase their confidence. It's going to encourage new parts of this community to come together for the first time. And then finally, the evaluation. So how are you going to know that what you've done is a success? And how are you going to prove back to that funder that it's worked? What do you have the right relationships in place? Have you got an evidence base already that you're working to, or perhaps you're working with evaluators and other things? And I always think of this in kind of long-term impact as well. So when you're in the pub in 15 years' time, and we can actually all go into pubs again, what are you going to tell people about the kind of amazing thing that you did 15 years ago? What is that kind of long-term thing that's happened as a result of this particular project or that particular organisation? So it can be a little bit dreamy. Sort of structure of a case for support might therefore be this laid out more or less, with evidence, perhaps with a case study of something. You need to start thinking about it in terms of telling stories and getting people to engage with what you're writing. And a good way to do that is to think about it in terms of the head. So every story is informing somebody, you're giving a bit of detail, you're giving something, a statistic that people can buy into and understand. It needs to be emotive. As I said before, I'm a sucker for an emotive punchline, and as most of us are, I think. So there's a balance between telling me, you know, without this service, 40,000 people in this London borough would not engage with X, Y, and Z, to me saying, well, this is the story of Mr. G, and Mr. G never came out of his house until he started coming to our older persons collections night event. I'm clearly not in marketing, but that sort of single case study is quite a good way of drawing out what the story is. Back at the turn of the century, when I worked at the London Borough of Hackney, there used to be some lovely events in the museum there where they would bring people out who contributed to the collections. There was a collection about a traveller community in East London, and there were some people talking there who'd been boxing in the kind of 50s and 60s from that community, and at a fundraising event, and this could easily be replicated online, they were talking about their experience of what the collection was depicting. And again, as a fundraising hook, that's way more powerful than me with my social pariah name badge saying fundraiser looming out of the mist with waving a sort of an invoice request at people. So think about who's telling this story to, and sometimes you can showcase the people and the beneficiaries of the charity, which you're wanting to bring people closer to, with their agreement, of course, in a way that's really beautiful and quite compelling for people. And then finally, the third part of every story for fundraising should be that you have a hand, that you've asked, that you physically, as we've said before, that you've approached them and that you've made a specific ask for some money, i.e. I need to raise X amount for this. Can you donate this amount? And if they say no, that's all right. Loads of people say no to you all the time. It feels like a much bigger deal, I think, when somebody says no to you in your mind than when it happens in real life. And if you just compare it to, you know, I'm sure you've been approached in the street by the charity people before, chuggers, I think they're called, aren't they? I had Cats Protection not that long ago come to me and say, can you give us some money? And I said, no, I'm sorry, and I walked off. And it didn't cross my mind again for the rest of the day. And that's probably the same way that people will feel if they say no to you. They're not going to go home and think, what a vicious, nasty organisation trying to leech money out of me. I literally didn't give it a second thought. And that's okay. And sometimes people will say yes to, and that's brilliant. Within COVID, I think it's important just to think about how your message might have changed a little bit. What's different now, and what's happening, and sort of thinking about how to reference the current pandemic and the situation in a way that you're not feeling like I'm turning my organisation into a COVID-19 response system, unless that is actually what's happening in your museum, but there's a temptation to dwell on it so much. I think my sort of advice about this is to reference COVID-19. Funders will want to know how it's impacted your work. The context, as we know, is really important in fundraising, so don't ignore the wider problem. And you can't, it feels weird when I see Donate Now pages on websites where it just doesn't reference it at all, and clearly people haven't updated it from before the pandemic. It just feels really odd that it's not referenced. Explain how it affects your work over, say, the last 6 months and how that's impacted your delivery, your staffing, and just be really honest about the challenges that you face. I think honesty and transparency, as I keep emphasising, has really gone a long way during this time in terms of building up trusted relationships with supporters. Explain how you're going to make a difference and why it is so incredibly competitive, as we know right now. Why are you the best organisation to deliver this? And actually, again, when you're having your conversation with colleagues about your case for support and those questions about distinctiveness, actually, if your collection was picked up out of your museum and handed to another organisation, how would that be? How would it feel different? What's special about you? What's distinctive about the way you interpret things or the way you are presenting your work and your ideas and history, in fact, to your consumers? There is naturally a massive shift in organisations' messaging towards social benefit, because it's not only critical at the moment, but I think there's a growing acceptance among people who aren't in our sector that there is a massive social benefit to culture. And so we want to just make sure that's really simple for people to follow and people to understand. And think about your place and show that you understand the rules. I mean, if you've reopened, explain how you're following the guidance, how you're doing that safely, give people that confidence and reassurance that you know what you're doing again. The Museums Association and Association of Independent Museums both have kind of reopening good practice guide. I'm sure you've all been bombarded with information and advice about how to do that safely, but maybe reference a little bit of that in terms of the logistics and making things work. So final couple of slides and things to think about with Case for Support then. Make sure it asks for support. I keep stressing it, but I can't reference that enough. Make it people focused and donor focused. And we talked about that kind of who is it, the you, the me, rather than the us. Tell a story and make sure you take on that head, the heart, the hand idea, that you've given people enough to intellectually engage with, enough to excite them, and then the sort of moment that you ask the money. If you can provide a problem and position that donor as a hero and as helping to solve that problem, that's a great way of engaging with donors. Provide some stats to back it up and give it evidence. And also, once you've gone through this process, make sure you use it internally as well as externally. As I say, it's a really interesting exercise to talk about how everyone in your organisation talks about your museum externally and what they say, and see what are the common threads. Maybe there's a really common brilliant bit of language that everyone's using that you could be using in funding applications, but you just haven't thought about it. Or maybe you're all saying very different things all the time, and that's quite confusing for people trying to engage with you about who you are and what you're all about. In that longer term and thinking about strategy, and again, there are other courses to do and other sessions to be done about strategy, but I thought it'd be remiss, given the time, not to talk about it. Here are some things to think about. As we've said, understand what your runway is. Think about 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. Try to secure what you can now in the short term, whilst at the same time planting seeds for later on. So have those conversations with the bigger funders now that you want to bring into your conversation. Perhaps test something. I think it's a really nice ask for a funder, a donor, a corporate, to just be told, we've written this case of support about why we think it's important. You're really trusted to us. Could you just give us some advice? Let us know what you think. See if they've got the space to cast their eye over it. We've done quite a lot of testing with a museum in the Northeast recently with external bodies having a look over case for support and messaging. We've got some really good advice and saying, do you know what you think is a really beautiful story just doesn't resonate with us as an individual. And then finally, if you're in the moment that you can think about opportunities, just have a little think and see what you can do next and what opportunities might be presenting themselves as a result of this. Are you doing something online that you hadn't done before and you didn't think you could, but in fact worked really well? What stuff might you want to stick and keep? So top tips to finish off, and then I'll hand over to Mirka from Arts Council England. Have some sort of plan and stick to it, even if that is 2 or 3 things at a time. Just do what you can, pace yourself. Make sure it's a team effort and make sure you embed fundraising as much as you can with your colleagues and with your organisation. Talk about it collectively. Lots and lots of research. Make sure you don't waste your time. Make sure that you can abide by funders' guidelines and that you're understanding who's interested, who's not. Talk to your colleagues in marketing about who's engaging with you. Don't actually forget to ask for the money. You can be confident and bold. It's an exciting time. Say thank you. Always make sure you thank people and ideally thank them again. And I think in the short term, quite often the best donors are those that you already have, even if you're not already, if you don't even realize they're donors at the moment, but they're already engaging with you. They're in your peripheral, they're in your organizations, they're engaging with you already. So have a look on your doorstep because they already share your value and your visions. You're not worried about finding somebody new. And that, my friends, is all I have to bore you with. I will hand over to Mirka now, but then we'll have a little session. We've got a few minutes at the end to ask either of us questions. And thank you very much for your attention.
Hello all, so nice to be here. Thank you, David. I've myself learned a lot. It's so nice to see and interesting to hear things from a slightly different perspective, obviously. So that was great. My name is Mirka Kotulicova. I work for Arts Council England. I am based in the London office, and I'm also part of the Museums and Cultural Property team. my sort of mission today is to briefly take you through project grants, and sort of suss out what project grants can do for museums and organizations right now. It's a much more specific thing than obviously the generic fundraising we've been hearing about, but super useful as well. So who are we? I mean, yes, as David introduced, statutory funding and all that, but there is also another way to kind of look at the work we do, and essentially, I guess we can position ourselves as an arts and cultural developmental agency here for England, which means essentially we champion and invest in cultural and creative activities all across the country, across arts, museums and libraries. Currently, we have a new strategy in place, and it's called Let's Create. It's on our website, and I would highly recommend you read it. It's also because, as David was saying, it's important sort of to connect to the sort of vision of your funder and know what they are about, what they are wishing to support, where they are aiming to take the communities and the country. So Let's Create is in place now for 10 years. And we will be working through our investment and the individuals and organizations we fund on these three outcomes. So it's about supporting individual people and therefore creative people, making sure everybody has an opportunity to essentially access creativity. It's about cultural communities and therefore partnerships and ensuring that communities, villages, cities, towns thrive in a collaborative approach to culture. And outcome 3 is about the sort of professional arts and museum sector. It's about having a super well prepared and innovative and strong cultural sector. And we will be doing that by investing into 4 investment principles, or what this essentially means. These are the kind of practical principles that we will be looking for, again, in those organizations and projects we fund. They will have to demonstrate ambition and quality, inclusivity and relevance, dynamism, and environmental responsibility. Now, project grants. This is one element of many other things we do. It's an open access fund, which means you can apply anytime. Essentially, anyone can apply. There are no deadlines, there are no interviews. There is a slightly different decision-making process based on how much money you apply for. As it says, you can apply for £1,000 to £100,000. And the £15,000 is a threshold there. So if you apply for less than that, the process is simple and shorter. You can know whether you will be successful or not within 6 weeks. And if you apply for more money, we ask slightly more questions, perhaps needs slightly more, a more robust evidence on things. So that process takes longer, about 3 months actually. Important to mention what we fund via project grants, of course. As I was saying, we fund arts activity, and so that's anything from visual arts to dance, music, theatre, and anyone and everyone can apply for that. So also museums, individuals, arts organizations, whoever. We also fund museums, accredited museums, specifically for museum practice, and I will touch upon that later. It's also interesting if your projects include use of creative media, as the slide says. It's one of those areas that I guess is of increasing significance given the world we live in. And use of creative media essentially means making and sharing work in digital means. It could be artificial intelligence, it could be digital tools, it could be mixed reality, 3D scanning, all sorts of stuff. It doesn't have to be part of your project, of course, it's an interesting element. What, however, has to be part of your project is public engagement, which is just on the other side there of this diagram. Because we distribute and redistribute national lottery money, as David was saying, there is an obligation that the money essentially benefits the public and audiences, whether in the short term or long term, and we will talk about that later as well. Just very briefly, you can apply for events, for R&D, tours, workshops, development, all sorts of things. We funded people who wanted to explode things in a van as part of their cultural activity. So this is the fund. If you have a great idea, fun idea, new idea, crazy idea, this is the fund to do it, because essentially project grants are for experimenting, for innovating ideas, for testing new ways of working, for pushing you as an individual or you as an organization to the next stage or to the next process, to a new dimension. So you can have a lot of fun, I think, with project grants. Then, of course, the other side is what we can't fund, the less sort of good news, I guess. There are certain things, and everything is on our website, by the way. There's a whole list of things which will ensure that if you mention these costs, or rather that you don't mention these costs, which means you won't be made ineligible. So basically, these are the things we won't be able to support, such as if there is no benefit to the public, as we mentioned. If you are mentioning general running costs or overheads, we don't fund that. This is a project activity fund, which means we will give you the money for some time, you are able to run this activity, and then the budget comes to zero, and we can't sort of contribute to your overall, and general overheads. We cannot fund activities that, of course, don't align with our supported disciplines or costs that are retrospective. Therefore, if you've incurred costs before we even make a decision on the application. And there in the bold down there, you see underdeveloped applications. That means sometimes it's really hard if you don't give us enough information to actually for us to make a decision. So in that case, you will be made ineligible, and we will ask for more information because, yeah, we won't be otherwise able to assess in a fair way. Now, museum applicants. As I was saying, museums essentially have two options. They can apply for an arts activity. Any museum, whether that's accredited or not accredited, small or large, you can apply for an arts activity. So a dance workshop, or I don't know, contemporary arts exhibition, or whatever it is, creative learning. But if you want to apply for museum activity, so that is to develop your work as a museum and the work with your collection, etc., you will have to be either a provisionally or fully accredited museum. You could also be a network or support organization that works with accredited museums, such as a subject specialist network. You can be a key funder of an accredited museum, local authority, university. You can still apply, obviously, on behalf of that museum or for that museum development project. You can also apply as an organization with a research relationship with an accredited museum. And for the first time, somebody earlier mentioned, what if there is an individual who wants to, as a freelancer, work with us, they can apply themselves if they work with an accredited museum or a series or a group of accredited museums. So that's a change there for project grants from the past, particularly for museum freelancers. What are the types of things we could fund? As I was saying, it's all sorts of things that relate to you as a museum organization. And importantly, there actually is this really useful museums info sheet that's on our website. So if you are considering this, I would highly recommend going there. It's a couple of pages. It's very simple. It's very, but at the same time comprehensive. So gives you all the information you need when you are looking at this as a museum. So yeah, you can apply for public programming, commemorative projects, digital and creative media projects that obviously develop or share the work of your collection or make people interact with the collection in a new way. Very interesting are also projects around consultation and bringing people into your work, into your research, into interpretation, into your learning, and essentially increasing the sort of the agency that people have in terms of decision making and what's the museum programming and how the museum can stay or become a representative. Outreach activity, as I was saying, community engagement of all sorts, projects involving children, young people, and learning, not formal learning, nothing that's part of the national curriculum, but all sorts of learning activities that museums are very good at, that also is quite compatible with project grants. Finally, I would mention also organizational resilient projects. So if you are in a position that you need to rethink your business plan, or I don't know, test out new income sort of possibilities or income streams, you can maybe work with consultants or, as I said, other partners, and you can design a program essentially that would be able to be funded in theory, depending obviously on the strength of the application, but in theory it could be funded by project grants as well. Having said all that, what we cannot fund are major capital-based work with statutory sort of requirements. For museums, it's important to say we cannot fund purchase of collections or purchase of collections items. However, obviously, if you're bringing loans in and there is a small fee or something attached, that's fine, but we cannot help you essentially acquire new works. We could, of course, if these were artistic commissions, but as I was saying, that's a sort of contemporary arts activity. And we cannot fund anything that doesn't have public engagement outcomes. So documentation and digitization, they could be supported if you are involving public in some way. And we could talk about that later, or stuff like that. But without a strong public engagement, if you're sort of doing it just behind closed doors and the public doesn't have an access to this, it won't be a strong application. It most likely won't be funded. Let's just look at actually what the application is composed of. It has 4 sections. quality, public engagement, management, and finance. The quality section is really about what it is that you will be doing. What's your idea? What is the premise of the rationale of the project? Why is it suitable for you? Why now? How is it contributing to your development and the development of the people you are working with? So as I was saying, this is primarily about the idea and the learning and the progress that will come out of this. Public engagement is all about how you'll be sharing the work, with whom, how will they know that you're doing this, how will they be able to participate. Again, as David was talking, I think he was trying to sort of highlight how it is important to be specific and distinct. And I think public engagement is that section where this definitely is true. Oftentimes people write things like, we would like everybody to come to this project, or we would like everybody to, and I think that's nice. Obviously, it would be problematic if you were trying to exclude people. However, you need to tell us who your audiences are and who else you will be reaching, but maybe include geographical information, age groups. Maybe they come from certain protected characteristics. You know, there is a certain breakdown of the audiences you can do so that we know exactly who you mean, rather than saying we will engage art students, you know, because that's a very, very broad category. And it's unlikely you will reach, obviously, all art students in England. So be quite specific. But also, obviously, it's COVID times. So if you're not going to be able to reach many people, if you will have to take most of your activity online, we understand that. You just need to tell us what's necessary, what's relevant for you right now. So don't worry if your activity is not something that, you know, you were possible or it was possible to do in the past. As I said, I know that it's not, obviously, it's not all the same right now. So just explain that in your application. In terms of management, this section looks at your expertise and your track record in terms of managing projects, but also your partners. And essentially, it's about risk mitigation. So if we give you this money, can we be sure that you will be able to, you know, deliver this project well? Is it all feasible? Did you think about the timeline? Or are you over ambitious and this is actually not deliverable? Or are you trying to do too much in a too short amount of time? So it's just all these really practical questions that needs to be considered there. And also, again, mentioning the COVID sort of context we're in, I would also recommend talking about the contingency plans you have and the risk management, obviously, you either prepared or are able to take into account. Yeah. And finally, finance. Normally, that's the thing with project grants, we would ask people to sort of secure 10% of match funding from other sources, either cash or support in kind, and then we are able to provide the rest. And obviously, the more match funding you have, in a way, the stronger the application. But of course, right now, it's very tricky to secure other support. And so between July 2020 and April 2021, we've sort of relaxed that requirement. So you can apply and you will still be eligible, even though you don't have that 10% match funding, you know? But of course, do include anything else that your partners or collaborators will be bringing to the project. As David was saying, support in kind, don't overlook that. There will be people giving you discounts on things, providing free equipment, providing free time. You know, they may not be able to give you cash, but they are clearly investing in your project in a different way. So mention that, because obviously that, again, contributes to the strength of your partnership and strength of your application. We have more assurance that all these people also want this project to happen. I would also highlight project grants between now and April 2021 essentially have some, well, I wouldn't say priorities, but there are certain areas that we would be probably more keen to fund than others because we find ourselves in the times we're in. And so we know, for example, individuals have been severely hit by COVID and there hasn't been much emergency support for them. So we are very keen for individuals to come through and apply to project grants for their time to research things and you know, time to stabilize. And that obviously includes museum practitioners, curators, educators, etc. If they want to work on some projects or connect with museums, that would be an opportunity for them to think about. We also fund, as I was saying, research and development and organizational development, very important, particularly now as people need to rethink the ways, you know, and yeah, sort of reconsolidate, restabilize, and try and navigate these waters in new ways. Again, fourth point there is live activity that can be safely delivered within this period. So rather than thinking when all this goes away, we will be able to do ABC, think this is where we are now. Maybe we're able to deliver some more smaller activities, something in a restricted way, or we can connect with our local partners. What can you deliver right now rather than speculatively at some point in the future? And activities that closely align with our equality objectives. Again, as I was mentioning definitely read Let's Create. I would also mention definitely read equality objectives. As we know, cultural sector, the world, of course, is not an equal place. There are some communities that have more access to arts and culture than others, some that have been more impacted in COVID than others. And so obviously, because we're not able to support everyone, we will have to and we will try to prioritize those who absolutely need that money, or who are able to deliver projects that goes to those who need that. So in those equality objectives, I think it's 5 of them temporarily, and then they will sort of merge with Let's Create next year. But these will be sort of instrumental when we make our decisions as to, you know, what we are able to and what we can fund, you know, with the limited funding we have. Sorry, am I going too fast? I worry I am, but I also don't want us to sort of spend too much time on the presentation when you have questions. So hopefully we can come back to some of these things later if you want to. Just very briefly, there is a ton, and that could be a good or a bad thing, I know, but there's a ton of advice on our website. There is how to apply guidance that I would definitely recommend. The museum's info sheet that I would recommend. You can talk to museum development, of course, who are super knowledgeable and supportive. You can talk to us, you can talk to customer services. Somebody mentioned grant team issues. So customer services are very much accustomed to answering those. And I know, be patient with the grant team. It's what, you know, it did save us some money, which means that we're able to use that money in other ways. Yeah, but grant team, customer services. And also, very importantly, if you have any access needs, that is, if you're facing any barriers, you may need a support worker to work with you because you're, I don't know, dyslexic, and our processes and Grantium, for example, could be, you know, inaccessible to you. Or if you need BSL interpreter, we are able to sort of pay for these costs, so to speak, in advance, so that you are able to submit your application. You have the same opportunity to submit as everybody else, and you are also able to include your access costs in your application. So if you need an access support worker, or as I said, you have additional access needs, you are able to sort of include those in the cost of your application. And don't forget about that. So that's me, very brief overview. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mirka. I don't know if you've noticed, there's a few questions in the chat that have come up.
No.
I can read them to you, it's fine.
I think Alice first.
Yeah. Can you include in their full cost recovery? That's the right term, isn't it, David? So that's sort of general cost associated with the project. So a portion of the staff that will be working on the project, a portion of the heat and light that will be used purposes for the project. Can that be included in the application?
Absolutely, anything. I will be super brief. Anything that's project related, yes. So if you have higher costs, or somebody's dedicating time to this, or I don't know, you have suddenly more, you know, higher stationary bills. If it is project related, fine. But if you're a regular employee working on these things anyway, then no.
Okay, thank you very much. How do you calculate supporting kind? Question.
That's, I mean, it really depends. So as I said, if somebody's hiring, somebody's, what's the right word? Not necessarily donating, but you can borrow the equipment for free, and that equipment has a higher rate of £200 a day. Well, obviously that's the money you're saving. So you can tell us, you know, this will save us £200 because we're hiring it for a day, and essentially we have it for free. Or if somebody is supporting you for free, but they also have a day rate, they are a professional. So if, I don't know, as I said, they are a consultant or mentor, able to sort of do this work for free, you are saving those fees, and I'm sure they will be able to tell you what the day rate is that you are there for, not having to pay in cash. Is that?
David's put afterwards that they National Heritage Fund have guidance on calculating the volunteers.
The volunteer in kind support, yeah. There's a handy, I was trying to find the link when you were talking, but I failed. But it's on the National Lottery Heritage Fund website.
No, I'm just trying to whiz through these because I'm aware that time is marching on. Someone else has said, can individuals apply for funding in conjunction with an unaccredited museum, or is it just accredited museums that can apply for this?
I think that's a good question. I think as long as accredited museums are benefiting, because as I said, they are, that's the sort of threshold at the moment. If you are partnering with other organizations, then that's fine. You know, you can obviously partner with community organizations, don't even have to be museums, but for museum practice, as long as accredited museums are also part of the project, you should be okay.
Okay, so it can be non-accredited partners, but as long as the
Accredited meetings are there. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to wrap up and say thank you so much once again to David, and thank you, Mirka, for that whistle-stop tour of National Lottery Project Grants. We're actually back tomorrow. David will be kindly delivering another Skills Plus session at the same time on forming partnerships and networks online, because in today's world we're not out and about meeting each other so much at events, and you can't have that casual catch up over a coffee, and it's much harder. And so David providing lots of tips, and I think there's a few of you coming tomorrow, but we do have some space, so if you want to come, then sign up in the usual way.